Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Tottenham Hotspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. Today, I'm going to be examining Fabio Paratici's relationship with Tottenham Hotspur and how the Spurs fans have embraced him over time. Now, Paratici is one of the most important figures in Tottenham's recent history, both guiding our on-field success through the recruitment of key players like Cristian Romero, who's now club captain, Pedro Porro, who's been one of our best players, and many others. But Fabio has also dominated the Spurs news cycle through his involvement in a financial irregularities investigation related to his time at the Italian giants Juventus. So this is how I'll structure the pod. I'll go over a history of Fabio Paratici before Spurs, during his time with us, as well as some other key figures behind the scenes at Spurs. I'll look into the signings made by Paratici during his involvement with our club, how popular Spurs podcasts have expressed their feelings towards Paratici over time, and I'll try to wrap up with some final thoughts that kind of brings everything together. Before I get started, just a quick call to action. If you enjoy what you're hearing from me so far or today, drop me a comment on social media, leave a Spotify comment or an Apple review, whatever. You can find me on Bluesky at poddenhampodspur.bsky.social, or you can email me at poddenhampodspur@gmail.com. Anything you can do that can help is very welcome. I'm just a one-man operation trying to do my best. All right, so let's do a little bit of Wikipedia searching. Looking into Fabio Paratici's history, just to ground us with a sense of where he's come from. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of his time before Spurs because, honestly, I'm not an expert on it. I think if you want to have a really good examination of where Paratici came from, I would point you towards Nathan A. Clark's discussion on Paratici for the extra inch that I'll link to in the show notes. But from what I can cobble together about him, he was a player of sort of not exactly setting the world alight. He was in Serie C, which is the third tier of Italian football. So he did have a playing career, established a relationship at some point with Giuseppe Marotta at Sampdoria and became their chief scout in 2004, and he stayed in that role until 2010. From 2011 to 2021, he had a number of different roles at Juventus alongside Marotta, including their sports director, chief football officer, etc. In July 2021, he took over as managing director of football at Spurs. And this role essentially was taking over from Steve Hitchen, who many of you will remember as not exactly a beloved figure at Tottenham. I think whenever I remember Steve Hitchen, I recall the Amazon documentary, the All or Nothing documentary, which was a training ground behind the scenes, sort of almost slice of life footage that they cobbled together. And in that documentary, in which Spurs are trying to present themselves to the world in many ways, Steve Hitchen was visibly uncomfortable with anything related to his job, it seemed. And I remember in particular saying him talking about how much he hated, for example, the January transfer window. So I wouldn't call Steve Hitchen exactly a beloved figure at Spurs for what he did for Tottenham. And if I'm honest, I wish I had done some research on which players Hitchen signed because I honestly can't remember them. So Paratici was in the role for about 2 years. But in early 2023, there started to be news coming out of Italy about financial irregularities at Juventus. Basically, cooking the books is what they were accused of. Paratici and his colleagues, including, I think, ex-Juventus legend Pavel Nedved, a few others who were executives at the club at the time, where they were inflating transfer valuations of their players to give themselves more financial wiggle room. That's my understanding of it. So in April 2023, he resigned. There was a ban in Italy, then UEFA, and then that was honoured at the FIFA level. So Paratici couldn't work in football directly, working with kind of external stakeholders and external partners. But he was allowed, after appeal, to do some work within football itself in a sort of consultancy role. And that's what he did throughout the period of his ban. And I think it was like a 30-month ban or something. It's worth pointing out at this stage that in April 2023, Paratici resigned. This was shortly after Antonio Conte blew up after, was it the Southampton game? When he really dug into Spurs as a football operation itself, especially leadership, and left us in an absolute mess. We went through 2 temporary managers after that, and Stellini and Ryan Mason, and we were just a bit of a shambles at the end of that season. So Paratici kept working with Spurs, advising on players, and you always got the sense of when Paratici was involved in something, because his recruitment style, if you can kind of call it that, was to have as many irons in the fire as possible at one time, and he was a very leaky operation. There was news coming out of journalists about what we were doing all the time. So when a transfer that happened between sort of April 2023 and now his return, you could always get a sense of what was something made or facilitated by Paratici. There would be rumours well before the transfer was actually executed. So this year, in about May, and bear in mind that he's been consulting with us this whole time, but there were rumours about his return in a full-time official capacity under Daniel Levy, who has now, as we all know, famously been stepped back from his role as chairman of the football club. But there were rumours in about May of 2025 this year that Paratici would be coming back full-time in some sort of official capacity, but we didn't know what. And then in October, just a week or so ago, he was rehired as co-sporting director with a focus on the players, transfers, loans, and pathways. I think it's important to look at what was happening at Spurs whilst Paratici was flitting in and out of the picture. Because, for 2 years, we weren't working completely without a manager of football, director of football, whatever. And just for anybody who isn't kind of clear, maybe somebody who's newer to supporting Tottenham, a director of football is supposed to give a long-term strategy to the football club. This is a role that has become very popular in the last 15 to 20 years. It didn't really exist in English football before then. The recruitment was facilitated primarily through what the manager at the time wanted and the chief scout. And, whoever else could come up, a deal that could be organised by a chairperson, for example. But they became trendy. And actually, Spurs were one of the first clubs to really adopt a director of football model. I forget the guy's name. Frank Arneson, I think, we brought in the mid-2000s to come in and give us a sort of long-term continental European style management structure where overarching football dynamics would be controlled at a high level at the football club and then executed by a coach of the first team. Of course, what happened with Spurs is that we hit some sporting roadblocks. Our form fell apart. Arneson and whoever else we had in that role were removed at the behest of our managers at the time. Notably, I want to say Harry Redknapp didn't want to work underneath a sporting director. I think that Maurizio Pochettino was also quite against working underneath a director of football during his time. But other clubs started picking up the sporting director model. Chelsea, for example, picked up Frank Arneson from us, and then Man City have executed it well, and it's just become the kind of the normal management structure at a football club, where you have a person who has a big vision that isn't subject necessarily to the day-to-day or the season-to-season sort of challenges that a manager has to face. If you want to sack a manager, in theory, you shouldn't have to rip everything up and start again, which, as we know, listening to Spurs podcast and looking on social media, is one of the biggest bugbears of Spurs fans at the moment, is a flip-flopping between different managerial styles whenever things kind of go off track. So in the period of time where Paratici was banned from working at a football club in an official capacity but could consult, into the role of director of football stepped Johan Lange. Now, unlike Paratici, Lange, I'm probably going to use both here, and I apologize. I'm an idiot, so, bear with me. But he was not a player as far as I can tell. He sort of coalesced into a coaching role at Copenhagen, working as their assistant manager in about, I want to say 2009. And he left in 2012 to go to Wolves, as an assistant coach to one of his compatriots. He moved back to Copenhagen as a development and technical director in 2014, became the Villa sporting director in 2020, and signed a number of kind of really important players for Villa. Emi Martinez, Matty Cash, everyone boo with me. Ollie Watkins, these have been instrumental in Villa coming from a sort of lower league team to becoming challenging for Champions League spots. However, things changed for Lange in 2023 when, in June, the kind of super director of football, Monchi, became president of football operations at Villa. Lange became the global director of football development and international academies, so he kind of got sidelined. He's best known as as a data user in his recruitment approach. Whereas Monchi, I think, is one of these people, a bit like Paratici, who has supposedly a large Rolodex of contacts and is very ingratiated with the super agents of the footballing world, the people who have big clients on their books, and they kind of can grease the wheels of progress towards getting deals done. So in October 2023, so what would this be, like 6 months after Paratici had to resign, Lange became the Tottenham Hotspur technical director, and all of these terms are kind of synonymous. You've got sporting director, director of football, technical director, president of football operations. They're all synonyms with probably slightly different roles depending on the football club and the period of time at which the work is being executed. And then in 2025, he became co-sporting director, promoted from his previous role into a sporting director position alongside Paratici, responsible for scouting, performance, football insights, performance analysis, and academy. So the theory being that these are dovetailing kind of skill sets and approaches, and also areas of responsibility that in the modern day cannot be handled by a single person between Paratici and Lange. That's what we've heard from Vinay Venkatesham, our CEO, in a recent video explaining the kind of structural changes happening behind the scenes at Tottenham. Another sort of minor player in this period of time was the involvement of Scott Munn, who came from the City Group. In 2023, was with us until 2025, and he was kind of our chief football officer, responsible for a lot of the stuff that happens at the training ground itself. And it seems like maybe Lange is taking over some of the responsibilities that Scott Munn would have had, but through sort of rumours and hearsay that we've gotten through the press and social media, Scott Munn wasn't exactly pulling up trees in that role as far as we can tell. I think it's worth pointing out as well that the co-sporting director structure isn't exactly the sort of de facto setup at every single football club now. I mentioned earlier how we transitioned to it being a lot more popular, but typically what you see is a single sporting director. This kind of makes sense. You have a person who's overseeing everything regarding strategy, vision, and footballing approaches that are giving the manager the opportunity to focus on just coaching, not all the other stuff. They can just be fed information. But we do see co-sporting director setups at other major football clubs. Chelsea have co-sporting directors. They've had this since the 2022-23 season in Paul Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart. And, for a club of Chelsea's size, it kind of makes sense. They have so many... Their transfers have become so sort of all-encompassing and dominant and weird that I can absolutely see why their approach with signing every young player under the sun on 7-year contracts would require 2 bodies to handle that. Brentford have a similar setup. So our current coach, Thomas Frank's old club, Phil Giles and Lee Dykes essentially fulfill the role of co-sporting directors. They have slightly different terms, but from reading around and articles on the subject, it seems like Brentford have a setup which is similar to what we're going to be doing moving forward. If we look into Europe, there's lots of other teams out there, but both Milan teams, both Inter and AC, have a co-sporting director setup. And German giants Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund also have a co-sporting director setup. So although this is new to us, and less than 10% of the Premier League teams before this season had a co-sporting director setup, it's not exactly unheard of, and it has been relatively successful elsewhere, at least insofar as it hasn't completely fallen apart at the first swing. So moving on to the signings made by Paratici, because, we're going to talk about him as a person, a little bit about his involvement in the Prisma financial irregularities investigation. But it seems like all that football fans really care about are results on the pitch. So I've pulled, thanks to Lily White Rose on Twitter and various different articles and Reddit posts about transfers, the signings made by Fabio Paratici and Johan Lange in their times with Tottenham. Now, obviously, sort of the latter's group of transfers are somewhat muddied by the fact that Paratici was consulting for us in this period of time. So how many of these you can truly call, sort of Lange successes or failures, or Paratici successes or failures is unclear. But at the very least, you could also point to that as being a reason that the co-sporting director model might have some success moving forward. So looking through Paratici signings, and they've made sort of approximately the same number from what I can tell. And I'm not entirely convinced this is a complete list, and there's a bit of a weird gap between the 6 months where Paratici left and before Lange came in. I don't mind calling him Lange. I swear it's Lange. Anyway, I've settled on Lange. I apologise to anybody whose ears are bleeding hearing me say that every time. But anyway, in that 6 month period where Paratici was gone, but we didn't have a sporting director, it's unclear sort of how many irons in the fire were established by Paratici already. So somebody in that gap would be like Vicario, for example. So anyway, so the list that I got from Lily White Rose on Twitter, he posted it a couple of years ago. For Paratici signings, we have Brian Hill, Pierluigi Gullini. Is it Pierluigi? Yeah, let's just call him Gullini. Danjuma, Longley, Emerson, Forster, Perisic, Bissouma, Bentancur, Richarlison, Destiny Udogie. Oh, Jesus Christ. Destiny Udogie, Spence, Kulusevski, Sarr, Porro, Romero. And he also appointed, I think, Nuno and Conte as our coaches, famously in quick succession. As for Johan Lange, there we go, I'm just going to mix it up for you. We got Xavi Simons, Randall Kolo Muani, Matisse Tell, Kota Taikai, Kevin Danso, Vuskovic, Kudus, Paulinho, Beraval, Gray, Odebear, Yang, Kinski, Dragishin, Werner, Solanke, and Frank. And again, you've got kind of Ange as a coach. Sorry, Thomas Frank as a coach there. But you've got Ange as a coach where he was appointed in the kind of half space between Paratici and Lange's period of time with us. So I think if you look at these lists, there's a temptation to say that Paratici has the better record. You know, you've got a number of players there who were or have now been key contributors to our first team and specifically to the success in the Europa League last season. You know, if I were to look namely, you'd say, you know, Bentancur has been a regular for us, Richarlison, Udogi, Spence, Kulusevski, Sarr, Porro, Romero, you know, were all huge players for us. Basuma played a really important role in the back end of last season. And Ivan Perisic was really important in that first Conte season. First or second Conte season? Whichever Conte season Perisic was around for before he got his ACL injury. But there's also some major duds and major wastes of money in here. You know, Brian Hill is probably the one to look at most, you know. Most concerningly, we traded a beloved player in Eric Lamela for Brian Hill, plus a bunch of money, and we basically didn't get that back. And then the other sort of fly in the ointment for comparing the two is that Johan Lange has just had less time for those players to become really important to Spurs. You know, Xavi is his probably biggest signing that he's made, but he's been here, a month, 2 months. Some of these players have also had unfortunate injuries. You know, Kolo Muani, he's also new and he's injured. A number of them are specifically young. It's unclear to me whether this was a tactic that Lange favours or whether this was a remit from the club. And I think that when people are talking about Lange preferring young players, it's important to remember that we've had a number of different squad homegrown issues, especially with the Champions League. So I think that for my opinion, one of the jobs that was given to Lange was to sort of restructure the age composition of the team and to target 16 and 17-year-old players so that eventually they would become homegrown for the Champions League. And of course, with that comes the fact that they need more time to blossom. They are not going to be key contributors in the same way that some of the first teamers favoured and signed by Paratici were. And I'm not sure if I have this in my notes, but if you look back at sort of Paratici's time at Juve, he was involved in a similar older recruitment setup where they favoured older sort of superstar players who would come in on a free, but would have high wages. We haven't really seen that in place at Spurs other than maybe Perisic, you could say. But it hasn't been like a particularly common feature. And there are also some young players that Paratici was involved in, we suspect, that that don't fit the mold of being a sort of older or established player like Radu Dragusin. However, the other key sort of thread amongst all of these signings for Paratici is a lot of them he had connections to already through his time in Italy, either coming from Italian clubs or similar. Whether that's sustainable, we'll have to see. You'd have to hope that it is sustainable, that we can keep bringing in huge players, or at least huge players of importance to us. So what did Paratici actually do in this kind of false accounting situation at Juve? Well, Juventus are, and like many clubs in Europe, have sort of financial sort of money flow problems. You know, the Premier League is such a huge financial beast now that all of the money is here. And there is a lot less money, relatively speaking, in Europe than there used to be. But to compete at the top table, like the Champions League, or to even just attract exciting players to your club, you need to pay wages. You need to balance the books in creative ways, shall we say. And so, as I said earlier, Paratici and his colleagues, they haven't admitted guilt on this, but they were accused of approving false accounting of how much players were worth when they were sold. So there was kind of a conspiracy with other clubs to inflate values, to move money around, and make their finances look a lot healthier than they were. Now, as a publicly traded company, this is, false company reporting. They were billing for non-existent transactions, And this is a huge, huge problem for the Italian sort of justice system and to deal with. So they came down hard on them. Juve is a culturally important club, huge, and they're doing things which which were illegal. So this was a big deal. So in 2025, he did make a plea agreement along with some of his compatriots that was accepted by the Italian courts. His ban, this was related to the Prisma trial, and his ban that was enforced by FIFA, worldwide football ban, expired, and he joined Spurs. So I think I'll save my thoughts on sort of the legal stuff until the end, so I can reflect back on how podcasts have expressed their feelings towards Fabio Paratici, which is kind of going to be the next little section that we enter into. So my goal here is to take a snapshot of how Spurs fans have felt about Fabio Paratici when he was hired, when he resigned, and when he was rehired. And because I can't look at all 100 Spurs podcasts across, time and space, I focused on some of the more popular ones as being perhaps reflective of different thoughts of Spurs fans, but also, what the majority of Spurs fans perhaps are resonating with. And specifically, I focus on the Extra Inch, the Fighting Cock, and the Spurs Show. Okay, so first up, we're going to look at the Extra Inch. For those who don't know, the Extra Inch is hosted by Windy, Bardi, and Nathan. They have a tactical focus on how Spurs play, and specifically the way that they express themselves and their feelings about Spurs tend to lean on a very strong ethical framework, where there's a sense of right and wrong, and they want Spurs to sort of be best. So back when Paratici was appointed, I got a podcast here titled Paratici Party, June of 2021, so a little bit after he would have been appointed. They spoke about how Spurs were going through a chaotic managerial search, were hopeful that Paratici could bring some logic to the search and remove Daniel Levy from the negotiations. Not really sure if that kind of panned out, sadly, considering that we went through Nuno and then Antonio Conte in quick succession. There was concerns about the lack of data in his discussions, in his video interviews for Spurs TV Online. Nathan voiced concerns about Paratici's role as right-hand man to Morata at San Pettorio and Juve. Again, talking about the high wages, free transfers at Juventus from Morata, and Paratici was perhaps more focused on younger players, was Nathan's assumption. But he did point to Ronaldo's deal to join Juventus as was facilitated primarily by Paratici behind his boss's back, and they feel like this wasn't a good transfer. The way that Ronaldo came in, hoovered up a bunch of money, and really sort of created a challenging financial position for Juventus to compete in. Bear in mind, at this point, the financial irregularities weren't yet public. So Morata leaves, Juventus fall off, but according to the boys, fans were unhappy with Paratici. However, in their opinion, they thought that his signings were overall good in the period of time after Morata left. And they were hopeful at the time that Paratici could adapt to Spurs and improve specifically on our ability to sell. And I find this very funny that 5 years ago we were complaining about our inability to sell, and we still are now. And of course, all of you old Spurs heads who are listening to this will point to the fact that this has been an issue of ours for probably decades. So when Paratici was banned, they talked about this in an episode titled For Richer or for Porro. This was probably more when the sort of timeline-wise, this would have been when the rumors came out, more than anything else. But at this time, there wasn't an awful lot of discussion on the Extra Inch about it, if I'm honest. They were annoyed about his transfer approaches, specifically the fact that Spurs seemed to be leaning on one guy with an earpiece. So you could say that these criticisms are more directed at Daniel Levy and the hierarchy at Spurs rather than Paratici himself. But at the very least, this was the way that Paratici was presenting himself, was kind of a one-man show. Always had his phone out on the touchline. Always had a sort of Bluetooth headset to take calls. He was very, very visible at Spurs games. He made it very visible that he was trying to do stuff. They had concerns about the fact that we had to cancel Matt Doherty's contract rather than being able to sell him or loan him out of the club due to squad issues. And they were also particularly annoyed at the time about the difficulty in getting Pedro Porro through the door and the delays in hiring him from Sporting. And again, some of these issues, could you say, is it Paratici that they're angry at, or is it Daniel Levy? When he resigned, there was a podcast called Masonry. This time, the extra inch were really more focusing, I say, on what was happening on the pitch rather than what was happening off the pitch. And they were particularly critical, though, when they did talk about Paratici, calling him a criminal as director of football. But again, their criticisms were targeted at Levy for hiring a criminal and his sort of structure and management of the club. And as for his rehiring, I don't really think that they've talked about it yet. Maybe they will soon, but from what I've heard from public-facing, non-Patreon podcasts, I haven't heard them sort of discuss Paratici in depth. Maybe a little bit this summer when the rumours started coming out. But it wasn't super easy to go through and find some of this information. I'm relying upon podcast search functions. Okay, so moving on to the Fighting Cock. Hosted by Flav Bateman, been on the show, go listen to that. My interview with him was a lot of fun. Anyway, they have a sort of rotating cast of characters, but generally speaking, it's the same people pretty consistently across the Fighting Cock, which is part of the reason that I focused on them. So back when Paratici was first appointed, they have a podcast that came out called Falling Out with Conte. They were particularly derisory about Steve Hitchen, so this calls back to my comment earlier about how the fan base felt about Paratici's predecessor. But from the way they were talking about him, Paratici was sort of a non-entity. He was just a guy coming in. I guess maybe Spurs fans were burned out on the idea of a sporting director coming in and having any kind of meaningful change at the club. And also he was coming from overseas, and you just got to admit that the sort of average fan perhaps doesn't have an intricate knowledge of another club's transfer dealings and whether they were successful or not in the context and culture of that football club. So when Paratici was banned, 21st of January, the Paratici Problem was a podcast put out by the Fighting Cock. Some of the expressions from the boys on that pod were not really bothered if he was sort of cheating, as long as he got good Spurs players. I think this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think it does speak to sort of desperation of Spurs fans in wanting to win. And they were more concerned about what his sort of banning would mean for Spurs at that time, because, as I mentioned at the top of the show, a sporting director is supposed to give you a long-term outlook and a long-term strategy and vision, and that was being ripped up and taken away from us. After he resigned, there was a podcast called Paratici in a Pack. So this was actually more post-ban, pre-resignation, my notes are saying, so apologies for that. But they were suggesting then that he could stay on as a consultant, which is kind of funny, but because they poo-pooed it, didn't think it would actually happen. But of course, this is what he would actually do. He was called the best thing at our football club. There was finger pointing at similar financial irregularities at City, Barcelona, Chelsea, etc. And again, there was blame directed towards Daniel Levy for not identifying this type of behavior during their background investigations into Paratici. So again, it's not that Paratici is to blame, it's Daniel Levy for hiring him in the first place, which I find funny. And now they have talked about, Flav has talked sort of extensively about the new structure at Tottenham on the lab. So not on the main Fighting Cock podcast, but now on his more serious Tottenham podcast, which I really enjoy. I'm being very careful because he might be listening to this. In an episode called The New Power Map, and it came out on the 15th of October this year. He did have a guest on for this, a chap named Anatol Pang, who works in investment banking, has a background in that. You can actually Google Mr. Pang and find out stuff about him and his background. I'll leave that up to you if you were interested in that. Overall, I'd really recommend this discussion. I thought it was a really nice sort of dissection of what the new sort of Lewis family, ENIC involvement in Spurs means, the new appointments that have been made, the executive chairman role, and specifically the co-sporting director, structure that's been put in place for Paratici and Lange sharing that job. I thought it was interesting that the guest stated that he felt that Paratici was actually in charge of what fans care about, player recruitment, not so much all the data and whether players are kind of getting tired or are being used effectively at the club. They both agreed, and I've heard this across multiple different podcasts, that generally speaking, in any line of work, any business, people job sharing isn't effective. There's no accountability, there's no sort of person to come in and break a tie, but they are trying to be optimistic about what this could mean for Tottenham. And as I said earlier, this has been a successful strategy for other football clubs. Neither of them had a particular care about Paratici cooking the books supposedly cooking the books at Juventus. There was a suggestion, I think it was from Anatole, that all clubs in Italy do this. I'm not sure how I feel about that. We'll wrap it up later. And there was concerns about a power struggle between Paratici and Lange. So I think it's very interesting considering they've already been working together. All right, so last little podcast we're going to talk about the Spurs Show. So Paratici was appointed. They had a podcast called The Wait Is Over. They didn't have a specific Paratici hiring episode because this was happening when Euro 2020 was taking place. So when Nuno was hired, they sort of talked a little bit about Paratici, and they actually felt that Paratici could have been sacked before appointing a manager because it was an awful managerial search that took us through a number of sort of guys who the fan base reacted really badly to, like Fonseca or really notably Gennaro Gattuso. So that kind of, I think that gives you a sense of what people were thinking about Paratici when he was early in the job. After he resigned, and I haven't got the podcast name here, sorry about that, but they were critical of leadership again for hiring him and the handling of the situation, because there was this ban that happened and then a delay. There was the investigation that was announced, a UEFA ban that didn't take place in England, and then a delay until we had to step him down. And I think they were critical of that, critical of communications. They talked about how sort of Juventus and Paratici was dodgy, and everybody in football knew this. And they were also critical of how some of his appointments, like Nuno and Conte, not being in the DNA of the club. You know, these are guys who are a bit more pragmatic, favouring on the whole three at the back in Conte's case with quite a sort of defensive setup. And as you all know, the game is about glory, about Spurs. It's about free-flowing, attacking football. So, you know, if you come back to this major vision that Paratici has, sort of back in 2023, people had concerns about whether or not he was actually sort of in the best interests of our football club's sort of sporting progress with something that the fans expect and enjoy. After Paratici was rehired, there was a podcast called Frank Exchange of Views, and they were similarly worried to Flav and Anatole about having two people in the same job, but they conceded that this is just kind of semantics. It's been explained that they have different, purviews in their remit, and they're supposed to be working together. Interestingly, one of the guests on the pod, Jacob Bernstein, was excited, pointing to the key players that Paratici had brought in, so Romero, Porro, etc. Again, financial irregularities being endemic in Italian football was discussed, and sort of implying that Paratici isn't therefore to blame. And there's sort of a discussion of his character, which I haven't really touched upon yet, and I hope to get into when I wrap up. But a discussion of him being a bit of a wheeler-dealer, a bit of a sort of smooth operator, versus Lange being a data-focused nerd who has a good track record. So we've covered a lot of ground so far. The history of Paratici and Johan Lange at Spurs, including their signings, the coaching. I'm not really clear on an overall sporting vision for either one of them in terms of attacking, free-flowing football, because I think that if you look at Nuno, Conte, and Frank, all three of those coaches are kind of pragmatic industrialists in some ways, in a sporting sense, focusing on structure and organization in a defensive setting rather than outscoring the opponent, which Spurs fans, a large majority of Spurs fans, say that they want out of our football club. You could also look at Mourinho in that period of time too, as being just before, as sort of indicative of that. So we've had a period of time where our sporting identity on the pitch, in theory, hasn't matched up to what our fan expectations are. Of course, we had Ange Postecoglou in this period of time, but it's really unclear to me how he was appointed, whether Paratici was at all involved in identifying him. Again, Lange, it seemed like he came in after Ange, but maybe he was hired by him. Even so, where's the consistency between those people? So, is Paratici's track record at Spurs good? Is it better than Johan Lange's? I think yes, on paper, but in practice, some of Lange's signings just haven't had time to become key players yet. They've both had some major duds that they've been involved in bringing into the club. Signing off on Timo Werner, for example, for Johan Lange. You could say that Paratici's had more clear duds. Hill, Golini, Longley. These are not beloved players at our team. Whereas Lange's failures so far are more just that they're players who haven't risen to the heights that we hope that they can. So, we're not really going to be able to judge them until 5 years from now, when it would be fair on both of them. I don't think there's an overall strategy from my perspective in terms of the sort of types of player that they're signing. It just seems to be, in Paratici's case, sort of technical players, sort of technically decent players he seems to like. Romero, Porro, although Richarlison's in there and I wouldn't call him technically excellent, but Basuma, Destiny Udogie, Jed Spence, these are all very good players, ball at their feet in different ways. Hill, of course, Emerson's in there. He's not really that, but I've seen people say that he seems to favour technical sort of floor raisers. I'm not so sure. Lange seems to be preferring kids from different markets, but then again, is that just because that's what he was sort of told to target in a younger age profile? I'm not sure. I think, if I'm honest, I think they're pretty equal. I don't think there's one of them is markedly better than the other than you could say that that you could say that Paratici brought in Christian Romero. So, as you might have picked up on the sort of podcast analysis section of this show, there was a change in the fan attitude towards Paratici. And I should point out that the Extra Inch guys haven't talked about Paratici on their show, but my understanding of what they've talked about, Windy and Nathan on Twitter, is that they have been critical on the rehiring of Paratici, I think from an angle of his involvement in these financial irregularities. But overall, you could sort of chart a course for Spurs fans from when Paratici coming in, of us being unclear about, what he was all about, other than being a little bit excited because he was coming from Juventus. Within a couple months, there was a bit of disdain towards him for the managerial search. By the time that we reached the sort of stage that he's been banned, fans are starting to appreciate some of the players that have come in. Maybe cherry-picking slightly the types of players that they want to be excited about. It also came at a period of time where Spurs were in tremendous turmoil. So it just felt a little bit perhaps like another good thing was being taken away from us, right? We had Conte, who was an excellent coach. Even if he'd fallen off a little bit towards the end, he was still, he's still an elite level manager. But we had a number of things that weren't going well for us at that period of time. Kane was sort of agitating to leave around that time. Did he have the Gary Neville interview yet? You had sort of managers leaving. We'd been through two, temporary coaches. it was a bit of a mess. So I think that's why fans were reacting particularly negatively at that time, and there was a lot of sort of anger and rage towards Levy and Enoch for the sort of coordination of all of this as the sort of ultimate bearers of the bag. Excuse me. And now Paratici's come back, and it's almost like he's been deified in his absence. Certain transfers and moves that he's made have looked much better in retrospect with the sort of Europa League win in our pocket. I'm not sure if he would look quite as appealing if not. A lot of fans also just don't seem to be enjoying the strategy that Johan Lange has brought into the club. Oh, sorry, also, just side note, I love how I've transitioned from Lange to Lange in this episode. Brilliant. Yeah, they haven't enjoyed the focus on youth. They're not immediate, Premier League level starters in some cases. They haven't hit the ground running in others. So there's been a frustration there. So I think Paratici coming back represents a return for some fans to signing oven-ready footballers. I hate that phrase, but that's where my brain went to. Of course, he's also been involved at the club in this time. So it's not like he hasn't been involved at all. I think there's also an element that there's the narratives that fans have constructed around Fabio Paratici and Johan Lange that has fed into the excitement and readiness to welcome him back into the fold. I was a little concerned about that Paratici's involvement with Daniel Levy. He was kind of seen as a Levy rehiring back in May. I was concerned that he might be sort of tarnished with that, but it doesn't seem to have been the case. Maybe because he was hired effectively after Levy, so there's the suggestion that he was a choice of the new footballing hierarchy at Spurs. But yeah, narratives around Paratici and Lange. We've all seen people online and heard people on podcasts refer to Paratici as Don Fabio, which is I find a really kind of gross xenophobic stereotype, if I'm honest. I'm not Italian. Italian folks might love it. It does seem to suggest a mafia don to me, which I think is particularly inappropriate considering his involvement in financial irregularities at Juve. I don't know why we're celebrating any kind of crime, whether or not he has murdered somebody or whether he has just cooked the books to sign some slightly better players. He's seen as this kind of smooth operator who, can. I think Steph on The Game Is About Glory was referring to him as somebody you'd want to sit down and have a shot of espresso with and chat to get a deal done. And I don't know if this is necessarily true of him. We don't know this guy. We've just seen little videos of him. There's been little rumors that have come out. But I can't tell the difference between the rumors and whether they're reality or fiction. There's a fan fiction that Spurs fans have and all football fans have around people at their club, that some people are, wide boys, other boys are, other lads are, kind of quiet, or yeah, I don't know. I feel slightly uncomfortable making decisions about whether or not Paratici is a good sort of rehiring for Spurs based upon, again, what I think are stereotypes in fan fiction. I think if you look at his actual signings and the actual decisions he made at the football club, I'm not quite sure if they're worth the risk. Again, I'm not saying that he's going to actively go out and go into the budget office at Spurs and tell somebody to delete some zeros or multiply something by 7 or whatever, right, and to make things look better. But I'm more concerned that he thinks that this is an appropriate strategy for a football club, to cut corners, to not do things in an appropriate way. And I think that risk isn't really worth what he's shown at our football club. Quite frankly, I'm a little disappointed that we brought him back as a consultant in the first place. It showed a lack of imagination on our part. That we couldn't go out and identify somebody else to fulfill and carry on, and either carry on or be similar to his original vision for the football club, whatever that could be. On the flip side, however, I talked about the importance of continuity with a director of football type position, sporting director, whatever you want to call it. And, maybe we should give props to Spurs for staying the course and keeping somebody in place to keep us moving in the right direction as decided by our football club. But of course, in the period of time since Paratici was hired 5 years ago, to his banning, 2-3 years ago, to now, there's been a major overhaul at the club. So is the sporting direction the same, or is this just an easy hire? I'm not convinced. On the flip side, we have Johan Lange, and people talk about him as if he's some kind of insular nerd who can't talk to people, can't get deals done. There was an assumption that this summer, some of the delays that we had regarding Morgan Gibbs-White, Eberechi Eze, were perhaps due to dilly-dallying and an inability to get deals done by Lange. I think that it's worth remembering at the time we also still had Daniel Levy in play, perhaps aware that things were not moving in his direction at the football club. So it's not entirely on Lange's shoulders. Who knows how much meddling Levy was doing this summer in an effort to keep his role at the club. I also just feel like a lot of people are assuming that football still operates like it did 30 years ago in many ways it does, but these are huge deals with lawyers in play and, millions and millions of pounds moving in different directions, and people are smart. People are really smart. So I think as much as Paratici might be called not a data forward guy or a smooth operator in terms of a negotiator, or in terms of taking clients out for dinner and being friendly and smooth talking them, it doesn't mean he isn't very well versed in all the other side of stuff. It's just not what his preference is. And same for Lange. Just because he is a different sort of type of person doesn't mean that he's entirely boring or unable to convince somebody to join. I mean, football clubs are either going to let somebody leave their club and join us because it's a good deal for them or not. It's not going to come down to whether or not they have a coffee with Fabio Paratici or not, or a Danish pastry with Johan Lange. These are just kind of stereotypes and fan fictions that we're writing about how they get things done. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm hopeful for the future. I think that Paratici and Lange can work together for the reasons that I've outlined. I'm excited for what Spurs can do with an interesting, innovative setup at the club. I wouldn't lean on the fact that it doesn't work elsewhere, because anybody who would take this role would be aware of the risks. I think that there's been a little bit of discussion across podcasts that Lange was promoted as just a way to sort of keep him happy. I don't know why Spurs would need to do that, because, again, if he isn't happy with being second to Paratici, you go out and find another data guy. I would like to think that under this new setup with Venkatesham at the head of it, that there is a new way of doing things. It's a little bit smarter, and that they see this as the right thing for our football club. And honestly, we're not going to know for a couple of years. We have a transfer window coming up in, under 2 months? January's coming around real quick. We'll find out what the plan is then. They've been working together for a while, Paratici and Lange. God, that's a third way of describing, of saying Lange's name. Sorry, everybody. They've already been working together. They know each other's habits. The assumption that there might be a power struggle that would be coming from Paratici's side, again, I think is a little bit based upon fan fiction around him rather than what we're seeing in reality. It might happen, but I've got no reason to believe that he's going to push Lange out. He could have just said, I won't come as sporting director unless Lange is subservient to me. That isn't what's happened. There's also been some concerns about having two people, whether or not you can get stuff done. Because, what happens if you have a tie? It's worth remembering that at the football club, there are more voices than just theirs. I think that Thomas Frank, or whoever's the coach, is probably going to be that sort of third person to come in and give an assessment of whether or not a player is worth signing or not. So let's see. Let's see. We had the fan forum recently. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of information on this. Paratici was actually sat in the crowd, not up on the stage. I mean, it kind of makes sense if he's only just been hired. It would be a little bit unfair to make him sit up and answer questions, but I would like to see that soon, quite frankly, if there's going to be a change in the sporting direction of the club. Yeah. All right, so thanks for being with me on this journey. I've mumbled my way through it. I've said people's names totally incorrectly. I've probably glossed over some pretty important facets of this story. I hope you've enjoyed it. I talked earlier, about dropping a like, etc. Do all the good stuff to help me boost the algorithm. Respond to me on social media. Drop a comment. I don't know. Send me a carrier pigeon. Whatever you feel like doing. Smoke signals I also respond to. And with that, keep making and listening to Spurs podcasts.